Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going to be tackling a statement that, well, let's just say it doesn't mince words.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head spinner.
It compares the U.S. to a, get this, third world banana republic.
Mm.
But then in the same breath, it lays out this grand plan for like this massive economic revival.
It's a really interesting contrast, gloom and doom, but also this almost like utopian vision of what America could be.
Yeah, it's a wild ride for sure. And just wait till you hear some of the proposals in here, like banning mortgages for illegal aliens,
Oh,
a
wow.
national sovereign wealth fund, even a shout out from, of all people, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Okay, color me intrigued. Let's break this down.
Right. So the author, they come out swinging right from the start. They're taking aim at the current administration, Kamala Harris in particular. They claim there is just rampant censorship going on
Mm.
and that the justice system is being totally weaponized for political purposes.
Okay, so right off the bat, you see this really strong emphasis on restoring what they call impartial rule of law.
Yeah, you hear that phrase a lot, but what does it actually mean in this context?
Well, what's interesting here is how they tie it to a very specific legal philosophy. It's not just about fairness in general. They actually point to a need to kind of go back to a system that's more in line with, how we used to interpret the Commerce Clause before, say, the 1930s.
So they're talking about like a fundamental shift in how the legal system actually operates.
Exactly. Now, where things get really fascinating is when the statement dives into economics. The author argues that the key to fixing the U.S. economy is to basically supercharge domestic production
Okay.
and their main target. Current trade policy, especially our low tariffs.
Wait, hold on. Isn't that like going back to the days of high tariffs to protect American industries?
You're right, it definitely has that old school protectionist vibe to it.
Yeah.
The statement even specifically points to the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a model. They argue that those policies were what made America a manufacturing powerhouse.
Yeah.
Of course, economists have been debating the actual impact of those policies for ages, but it at least gives you an idea of the historical framework this author is working with.
Yeah, for sure. And they're not afraid to make some pretty bold claims either. They say this approach could bring like trillions of dollars back to the U.S. economy.
Trillions with a T.
Right. And create millions of new jobs. Is any of that even remotely realistic?
Well, the trillions part is definitely eye-catching, I'll give them that.
Hmm.
Their argument basically hinges on the idea that if you incentivize domestic production enough,
Mm-hmm.
companies will relocate their operations back to the U.S., bringing all those jobs and all those dollars with them.
Okay. I see.
And they specifically target manufacturing, transportation, even defense as areas that are right for this kind of job creation.
So this all ties back into that national security angle they keep hammering on, right? Like we've become too reliant on other countries, especially for the things we need to, actually defend ourselves.
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of a Cold War mentality in there, this idea that we need to be self-sufficient in all these critical areas.
Right.
And, we've actually seen this play out in the real world recently. Remember the whole semiconductor chip shortage?
Yeah.
Suddenly, everyone realized just how vulnerable we were because so much of the production was overseas.
Exactly. But wouldn't shifting like all critical industries back to the U.S. be incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible in today's global economy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is it even feasible? And if it is, would the benefits really outweigh the costs?
Right.
Now, to get a little more specific, let's dig into how this statement tackles inflation, because it's a hot-button issue for a lot of people right now.
Yeah, and they really go after the current policies, blaming them for, all the rising prices we're seeing. They promise a totally different approach.
This is where understanding different schools of economic thought becomes really important, because they're coming at this from a very specific angle. They take a hardline stance on inflation, blaming it squarely on, they specifically call out specific policy X and specific policy Y from the current administration. For example, specific policy example,
Okay.
which of course, contrasts really sharply with the administration's current focus on, well, I guess you could sum it up as targeted investments and some price controls.
Right, so it's like two completely different diagnoses of the same problem, which obviously leads to two completely different prescriptions.
Exactly. And their prescription is, well, let's just say it's unconventional. The statement advocates for, slapping tariffs on foreign goods
Uh-huh.
and cutting what they call wasteful spending, which you can imagine puts them at odds with a lot of the current administration's, economic policies.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of contrasting views, let's move on to housing affordability. The statement spends a good chunk of time talking about, like, slashing regulations and opening up federal land for development. Their argument is basically that regulations are what's making homeownership like a pipe dream for so many people, especially, young families.
They argue that by removing those regulatory burdens and by making land more readily available, we could see housing prices actually drop, maybe even substantially.
I mean, I get the appeal of that, but isn't it a little simplistic? Like, haven't there been cases where deregulation has actually led to more problems down the road? I think about the savings and loan crisis in the 80s.
That's a valid point. And then there's the whole issue of opening up federal land. I mean, you have to think about the environmental impact.
Right.
We're talking about preserving natural habitats, managing water resources, ensuring, that end development is actually sustainable. It's a whole web of interconnected issues.
Not to mention the infrastructure that you need to support all that new housing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Roads, schools, utilities, somebody has to pay for all of that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to, well, I guess you could call it the elephant in the room, how all of this ties into the statement's stance on illegal immigration.
Yeah, because they really don't shy away from controversy, do they?
No, not at all.
They flat out argue that illegal immigration is driving up housing costs and taking jobs away from Americans, especially, they point out, in African American and Hispanic communities.
And their proposed solution, a complete ban on mortgages for anyone who's in the country illegally.
Wow, okay, that's a pretty extreme measure. But is there actually data to back up their claims about, the impact of illegal immigration?
Well, that's where things get a little tricky.
Mm-hmm.
The statement does cite a couple of studies that support their view, but those studies have also been criticized, for their methodology.
Yeah.
It's a very contested area of research, and it's easy to, cherry pick data to fit a particular narrative.
Right. And even if you accept their claims, as accurate, is it ethical to basically deny a whole segment of the population access to something as fundamental as housing?
That's a huge part of the debate, right? I mean, it's not just about economics. It's about human rights and social justice. Does restricting access to housing actually solve any problems, or does it just create new ones?
Yeah.
And what message does it send about, who we are as a nation?
It's a real moral and political minefield for sure. Now, before we get too lost in that debate, let's shift gears for a second and look at one of the, I guess you could say, more out there proposals in this statement, the idea of creating a national sovereign wealth fund.
This one definitely caught my eye, too. They envision this massive fund fueled by, tariff revenue and some other sources that would then invest in these huge national projects to, revitalize the economy and rebuild our infrastructure.
So it's like a giant investment vehicle for national development.
Exactly. Now, I've heard of these funds before, but mostly in countries that have tons of natural resources, like Norway or, the Gulf states. Are there any examples of sovereign wealth funds actually working in a country like the U.S.?
Well, what they propose is actually more similar to, say, Singapore's model than it is to Norway's, which is interesting.
Okay.
Because that could potentially mention a unique implication for the U.S. based on the source. It all depends on how the fund is structured and managed,
Right.
Transparency and accountability are absolutely key if you want to prevent corruption and make sure the fund actually benefits everyone, not just a select few.
So it's like a high-risk, high-reward kind of thing.
Exactly. You could see huge benefits, but it could also backfire spectacularly if it's not handled really carefully.
Okay, so last piece of the puzzle I want to touch on before we move on is, that endorsement from Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a name that carries a lot of weight, especially among, environmentally conscious voters.
For sure.
Yeah, it definitely gives the statement some extra credibility, especially since it talks a lot about food safety and, investing in modern agriculture. Right. And Kennedy Jr. has built his entire career on advocating for environmental protection and public health. So seeing his name attached to this does lend some weight to their claims about ensuring safe and healthy food for all Americans.
No, they don't actually get into specifics about what they mean by modern agriculture, though. What are, some of the latest developments in that field that they might be referring to?
Well, we're seeing a ton of innovation in agriculture these days. Things like precision farming techniques that use data and sensors to, optimize crop yields.
Hmm.
And then there are advancements in biotechnology and genetic engineering that can be used to make crops more resistant to pests and, even climate change.
So there's a ton of potential there, but like with everything else, there are definitely trade-offs to consider. Speaking of trade-offs, I want to go back to the statements like overall vision for the economy. They paint this picture of an economic renaissance,
Hmm.
money flowing back to the US, millions of new jobs. But it seems like they're also pushing for this pretty dramatic shift away from globalization.
Well, I
Right.
mean, how realistic is it to, like, actually turn back the clock on something like that?
It's a bold vision, no doubt about it. And it raises a lot of questions about, what the long-term consequences might be.
Right.
People who support this approach would argue that it's about, putting American interests first,
Uh-huh.
bringing back those manufacturing jobs that were lost, and, just reducing our dependence on foreign countries.
Yeah.
They'd say it's about restoring America's economic dominance, on the world stage.
Okay, I get that. But what about the potential downsides? Like, couldn't this lead to trade wars, damage our relationships with key
Those
allies?
are definitely risks to consider. Critics would argue that this kind of protectionist approach could actually end up hurting consumers.
Hmm?
By driving up prices, stifling innovation. They'd say it's a very short-sighted strategy that kind of ignores the realities of, how interconnected the global economy is these days. It's interesting how this statement really taps into like a lot of the anxieties people have about the economy right now.
Yeah.
The fear of losing jobs to overseas competition, that feeling that the American dream is like slipping away.
Absolutely. It speaks to that sense of economic insecurity and maybe even a bit of nostalgia for a time when, America was seen as this undisputed economic powerhouse.
Right. But is that really the path back to prosperity? Or are they like clinging to this outdated model that just doesn't work in the 21st century?
I think that's the million-dollar question. It's a complex issue, and there are no easy answers.
Hmm.
But this statement definitely forces us to, really grapple with some fundamental questions about America's role in the global economy.
For sure. And one thing this statement definitely does not shy away from is controversy, right? I mean, they take on some really sensitive topics like immigration.
Yeah, and they frame the whole issue in a way that's, pretty much guaranteed to be divisive. They talk about illegal immigration as this, like, drain on the economy,
Yeah.
taking jobs away from Americans, driving up housing costs. It's a very stark picture.
Yeah. And then they propose these pretty radical solutions like that ban on mortgages for illegal aliens we talked about earlier.
Right. It's a very provocative stance, and it raises some serious ethical questions. Like, even if you accept their premise, that illegal immigration is having this negative impact on the economy,
Mm.
is it really fair to punish people who are just trying to make a better life for themselves and their families?
Right, right. And how do you even enforce something like that? It seems incredibly complex, not to mention potentially discriminatory.
It would be a logistical nightmare for sure. And it could open the door to all sorts of unintended consequences.
It feels like they're really trying to appeal to the sense of like fear and resentment,
Hmm.
painting this picture of us versus them.
Yeah, you can definitely see that element in their rhetoric. They're playing on people's anxieties
Hmm.
about, job security, economic stability, even their cultural identity.
It's a powerful message, but it's also one that can be easily exploited, right?
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to approach this kind of rhetoric with a critical eye. We need to look beyond the emotional appeals and, really examine the evidence carefully.
No, one of the, I guess you could say, more intriguing proposals in this statement is the idea of creating a national sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah.
They talk about using this fund to like invest in infrastructure and other national projects.
It's an interesting concept. It's not something you hear discussed very often in American politics, at least not
They
seriously.
make it sound like this could be like a real game changer,
Hmm.
a way to jumpstart the economy and really secure America's future.
But it's also a high risk, high reward kind of proposition. I mean, these funds can be incredibly successful, but they can also be totally mismanaged and end up doing more harm than good.
So, like, what are some of the key factors that determine whether a sovereign wealth fund succeeds or fails?
Well, transparency and accountability are absolutely crucial, right?
Mhm.
You need to have really strong safeguards in place to prevent corruption and to make sure that the fund is actually being managed in the best interests of, the country as a whole.
Okay, so transparency, accountability, what else?
And then, you have to think about what you're actually going to invest in. The fund's investment strategy needs to be really carefully considered, and it needs to be aligned with, the country's long-term economic goals.
Right, so it's not just about like throwing money at problems, it's about having a clear vision for the future.
Exactly. It's a fascinating idea, but it's one that requires a lot of careful planning and oversight.
Yeah, it's definitely not something you can just like throw together overnight. It
Right.
requires that long-term vision and a real commitment to, sound economic principles.
For sure. Now, one more thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap up is that endorsement from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I mean, that's
Yeah.
a pretty big name to have on board, especially given his, reputation as an environmental advocate.
Yeah, his endorsement definitely adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing.
For sure.
Because, Kennedy Jr. is known for being really outspoken on environmental issues. But this statement also seems to be pushing this pretty, pro-business, pro-growth agenda.
Right.
How do you reconcile those two seemingly contradictory positions?
That's a really good question. And it speaks to, that broader challenge of trying to balance economic growth with environmental sustainability.
Yeah.
It's something that a lot of countries are struggling with right now.
Okay. Now, they talk about investing in modern agriculture, but they don't really get into specifics about what that means.
Right.
So what are some of the, technologies or practices that they might be referring to?
Well, modern agriculture can encompass a lot of different approaches, really. It could be anything from precision farming techniques, where you're using data and sensors to optimize crop yields,
Uh-huh.
to, advancements in biotechnology and genetic engineering that are aimed at, increasing crop resilience and reducing our reliance on pesticides and herbicides.
So there's a lot of potential for innovation there, but there are also, a lot of ethical and environmental considerations to weigh as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to have, a really nuanced conversation about these issues, recognizing that there are trade-offs and complexities involved.
For sure. Well, this statement has definitely given us a lot to think about.
Yeah, no kidding.
A bold vision, to say the least.
It really is.
And it raises some really important questions about the future of America, where do we go from here?
It's a vision that's rooted in, this deep sense of patriotism, this desire to restore America to what they see as its rightful place in the world.
Uh-huh.
But it also reflects a certain level of anxiety, even distrust, I think,
Yeah.
of the status quo.
Yeah. It's like a mix of hope and fear, optimism and pessimism. And it really speaks to, this kind of underlying sense of uncertainty about the future.
Absolutely. And one thing's for sure, this statement is a call to action. It's urging people to get involved, to make their voices heard, and to fight for the future they believe in.
It's a reminder that we all have a stake in shaping the future of our country, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that our choices actually matter.
They do.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored, this statement's vision for America, from its economic proposals to its stance on immigration and national security.
We've looked at the historical context,
Mm-hmm.
analyzed the, potential benefits and risks, and I think we've done a pretty good job of, considering the ethical implications of some of the more controversial ideas.
For sure. And now is your turn to weigh in. What do you think of this vision for America? Does it resonate with you?
Or do you see it as, a dangerous path? We want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, share your comments below and let's keep
Yeah.
this conversation going. It's funny, as we've been going through this, I keep coming back to this idea that it's not really just about the specifics,
Mm-hmm.
It's about tapping into a certain, I don't know, emotional undercurrent. It's like they're trying to channel this nostalgia for this bygone era when, America felt more certain of its place in the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
There's definitely this, yearning for that Make America Great Again kind of sentiment, even if it's not explicitly stated.
Right, exactly.
It's about recapturing that sense of strength and independence, economic dominance.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. But then at the same time, there's also this undercurrent of fear running through it all, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Fear of economic decline, fear of losing our national identity, just this, general fear of the unknown.
It's a potent mix, and it definitely resonates with a lot of people, especially, in times like these,
Right.
when there's so much economic uncertainty and political polarization. People are looking for simple answers,
Yeah.
They want someone to tell them that everything's going to be okay.
And this statement kind of offers that, right? It's a very clear vision, even if it is controversial, for how to get there. It appeals to a certain segment of the population, the people who feel like the system is rigged against them, like the American dream is slipping out of reach.
It taps into that sense of grievance and disillusionment, that feeling that the elites, whether they're political or economic, have just completely lost touch with the needs of everyday Americans.
Yeah, for sure. And it presents like this really radical solution. It's like, let's just rip off the Band-Aid and start from scratch.
Right. It's a bold gamble. It definitely carries a lot of risks.
Uh-huh.
But for people who feel like they've got nothing left to lose, it might seem like the only option.
So where does that leave us? I mean, we've unpacked this whole thing. We have examined all the claims, explored the potential consequences. But ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide, what they make of it all.
Right. Our goal here wasn't to tell anyone what to think. It was to, give you the tools to think for yourself.
Exactly.
We've highlighted the key points. We've provided some context, offered some different perspectives. Now it's up to you to weigh the evidence and, come to your own conclusions.
And as you do that, we really encourage you to think critically about it all. Question the assumptions, consider the potential impacts of, what this statement is proposing.
Because ultimately, the future of America is shaped by informed citizens who, actually engage in thoughtful debate and make their voices heard.
Exactly. This deep dive was just the beginning of the conversation, right? We want you to keep exploring these topics, do your own research, talk to people who hold different views than you.
Because the more informed we are as individuals, the better equipped we'll be to, actually tackle the complex challenges facing our nation.
And to create a future that actually works for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and, maybe even a little bit thought-provoking.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.
Until then, stay curious.